If you're new to photography and you've never shot in manual mode because you're overwhelmed by words like shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, that's okay. We've all been there and we've all been just as lost. I promise there will come a time after an extended period of shooting with your camera where shooting in manual mode will just feel like muscle memory. But until then, choosing things like the right aperture can be really overwhelming, and that's what I want to help with you guys in this video. Now, if you're new to photography and shooting with DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, you might have wondered, how do people achieve that really nice blurry background when taking a portrait? And that's really Aperture at play. Aperture has two functions when taking a photo. One, letting in less or more light, and two, changing the depth of field in your photo. Now, if you look down the barrel of your lens and right into the middle, you're gonna see this little dark hole that looks kind of like your pupil. This little hole is called the iris, which is adjusted in aperture sizes called f-stops. And basically, the wider this hole or aperture is, the more light you're letting in, and the smaller that hole or aperture is, the less light you're letting in. For example, if you have your aperture at 1.2, the iris is gonna be wide open, letting in a lot of light, whereas if you have it at f16, it's gonna be a lot smaller, letting in a lot less light into your camera. Each lens is gonna have a different f-stop. For example, this prime lens that I own, this is a 50mm 1.2 lens, meaning the widest it can be is 1.2 and the tightest and smallest aperture number is f16. So if I was shooting in a really dark setting, I would definitely throw on my 50mm and try to shoot as wide open to allow in as much light as possible. Whereas if I was shooting outside on a really bright day, I would increase my aperture higher in order to control the light coming into my camera. Now, the second part of Aperture is where the beginner photographer is gonna be really blown away. If you've ever wondered, how do people get that nice blurry background behind the subject if you're taking a portrait of somebody, that's a shallow depth of field created by Aperture. So the smaller your aperture number or f-stop is, the more blurry your background is gonna be, and then the higher the aperture f-stop is, more of the photo is gonna be in focus. So this is what we mean by the term depth of field. Basically, how much of the photo is in focus and sharp. So if you want to take a portrait of someone and have the background completely blurred, isolating your subject from the background, you want to use an f-stop of 2.8 or smaller. This is where buying prime lenses that have f-stops of 1.2, 1.4, or 1.8 come in handy. If you've recently bought a DSLR or mirrorless camera and it came with the basic kit lens, I would highly recommend spending even just $100 and buying the basic 50mm 1.8 lens for Canon or Sony, just to be able to get a lower aperture so you can get a nicer blurry background. In the end, it's a really small investment, but it's gonna really give you the control over the depth of field in your photos because you can put the f-stop to a lower number. Now, on the other side of the coin, if you want your photo to be completely sharp and in focus from the foreground to the background, then you're gonna wanna use a higher f-stop number from f.8 to f.11 in order to achieve that. These settings will be perfect, for example, when you're taking landscape photos where you really want everything to be in focus and sharp. So just to recap, if you wanna have a really blurry background, a shallow depth of field when you're taking, for example, portraits, use f-stop 2.8 or smaller. And then if you're shooting landscapes, for example, I would suggest using a higher f-stop like 8 to 11, just to have everything in focus and sharp. Now, when most beginner photographers discover what aperture is and how to achieve a shallow depth of field, they can get a little bit overexcited and always shoot wide open. But this might not be the best settings for each moment. For example, if you're taking a portrait of someone from really close and you have a really shallow depth of field, you might get into the situation where the eyes are in focus, but the nose is not. So a more experienced photographer will know what f-stops to use in which situations, and really you're only gonna learn kind of these boundaries just by practicing and shooting. But whenever you take a photo, just look quickly, is the eyes in focus and is the nose in focus? And if not, then increase your f-stop to a little bit higher, maybe to f2.0 or f2.8, depending on which lens you're using and how close you are to your subject. The opposite can happen for landscape photography. I know personally I've made this mistake very often because I often shoot people and I often shoot at f2.8 or lower, and I might just get stuck into that same rhythm when shooting a landscape photo, and all of a sudden I realize that my landscape photo is not in focus fully and it's not that sharp. So don't make the mistake when you're shooting landscape photos that you shoot at 2.8 or lower. Make sure you're shooting a higher f-stop because you want everything in focus and to be sharp. So whenever you're out shooting, a good tip to ask yourself is, what do I want to be in focus in this photo? If you want the subject to just be in focus, then use a lower f-stop. But if you want everything to be in focus, then use a higher f-stop. But yeah, that's Aperture in a nutshell. The lower the aperture number, you're gonna get more light in, a shallow depth of field, and the higher the aperture number, you're gonna get less light in and more of the photo in focus and sharp. Hopefully this video has clarified all the confusion, and the next time you go out, you're gonna have the confidence to know which aperture number to choose for that situation. All right, we're out of here. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button, comment below. I would love to hear from you guys. We're out of here.